I wanted to start off by asking, do you have sort of a definition you work with for what a safe school is or looks like?
That's a million-dollar question, right? So I think to me, it really is about it's about creating a balance between creating a space where you can create a sense of physical safety and security with one that is about kind of a place where people can feel like they belong and that they're socially, emotionally safe, right? Where they can be vulnerable, where they can really thrive and oftentimes we think of those things as mutually exclusive, right? That it's either and, it's either safe and secure or it's warm and welcoming, right? And I am truly a believer that when you're designing a school in the right way, it is and should always be both. That's kind of how I would define it.
And this is your area of expertise, right? You kind of focus on K through 12 buildings.
Yeah, so probably for my career, it's about 30 years now. I've been exclusively in the planning, design, and facilitation around public K-12 buildings. Yeah.
How have you seen the demands or the visions from districts evolve in that time?
So I will say primarily it's episodic, right? It tends to follow big events, unfortunately, and then just kind of like our national sort of psyche, we kind of go back and say, okay, I'm not going to think about that for a while. But I will say, probably since Columbine, in terms of my career, there was a noticeable shift in saying, okay, we have to think differently about how we design our schools to do a couple of things. I will say to ensure that we're putting in those necessary features that will allow us to react in the event of kind of the worst things happening in our imagination. But then we also need to be proactive and think about what are those pieces that we can create, what are those pieces that we can have that allow us to really try and prevent maybe some of the isolation that kind of leads to events or just even day-to-day bullying, right? And so where I would say in my career I've seen change is the balance that you see between those, right? And that's where that episodically all of a sudden the natural reaction is we want to build as secure a place as possible and kind of forget all the other stuff, and then you kind of go back to kind of a more probably reasonable balance. And then over the course of the last probably 5 years, the piece that's been added to that has been kind of an equity lens, right? So really thinking that what each of us determines as safe, as secure, warm, and welcoming, it changes depending on what your lived experiences are, right? What could feel very warm and welcoming to me, or better on the other end, safe and secure to me, for somebody else might make them feel really uncomfortable and really not safe, right? And so trying to think about, we don't design our buildings just for one user, right? So we have to ensure that everyone that comes into that building can have a positive experience with them.
You mentioned some of the features that are more reactive in a building. Can you
walk through some of
kind of
those?
clarify, yeah, what those are?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the big thing that we're always trying to strike a balance between are, if you're thinking about, for instance, an active shooter, right? What are things post a big event, a big national event, we hear from people about hardening of schools, right? So those are, creating fortified entries and having, kind of limiting the amount of glass that you have throughout a school, thinking about, much more surveillance in a kind of in a just a really intense way. And all of those things, I think, an ability to lock down a school in a variety of kind of levels and, at a classroom door, at a learning neighborhood door, at a front door, and all of those pieces that kind of play in. So I would say that those pieces, the level to which they are visible, the level to which they are I'm going to say obtrusive, that is where kind of we get into that reactive mode, right? Because then you're reacting to an event rather than planning for kind of day-to-day operations.
So how do you temper that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's conversations, right? I think you have to, I would say that everything we do is in response to what we hear in community, and um, and guiding a conversation to say, first of all, what are the higher frequency events, right? What happens more often, whether it's, trying to prevent bullying, or again, trying to make sure that a community that comes to your school feels like they're welcome there and that they have a place of belonging. Those you would hope are everyday events, right? And the more infrequent events, big fights, things like an active shooter, domestic violence, kind of custodial issues, those are fewer and further between, but they have the potential for greater risk, right? For what I call kind of higher impact. And so what we tend to do is we say, again, I'm a firm believer that it's not an either or, that you need those pieces, but you need to design them in a way so that it's not the first encounter that you have, right? So that it doesn't feel like you're going into a prison, which, we don't want our schools to be fortresses, right? We want our schools to be open and full of natural light and a place where kids can thrive. But I want to be able to pick my kid up every day, when I'm done, right? And so it is, to me, that's where that balance is. So, on the other side, we say, okay, yes, we have to ensure that, with the use of technology, we're able to lock down, if we see a threat coming into a school, be able to lock it down and kind of ensure that we are providing a level of safety for staff and for students in the building. So what that means is that we've got to ensure that admin, that the office is where it needs to be located so that they can have kind of eyes on the street, right? So that way you can see what's coming, both good and bad, and be able to have time to react to it, right? The key thing in designing for safety and security is time and layers of safety, right? When you're designing truly for safety and security. And then you're also thinking about what is the user's experience and how can we then start to say, what do we build in to ensure that we are creating opportunities for most of the time students, right? But in some cases staff, to have a sense of accountability to one another, to feel connected, not isolated. And that those are things that are more intangible. And so oftentimes they're not the easy things to spot and say, oh, just put a fortified entry in, right? But the things we talk about are kind of that balance of, transparency can also be really good. We talk to first responders, we talk to mental health counselors, and we talk to teachers in schools, and they're saying, hey, the more eyes we have on the street and the more connected that people, are able to make eye contact on a daily basis. And I can say, I got to check in on Brandy. She looks like she's having a hard day today. Normally she got a smile on her face. Today she doesn't. And I was able to see that. You maybe weren't in my class, but I was able to see that. Or, maybe I'm your counselor and you didn't come to see me because you weren't in crisis. But because I now have that connection, I'm able to say, okay, I got to go check in before something could turn into something, a crisis.
That has to be such an incredible challenge, because every school community is different and the needs are gonna be a little different. So how do you start that?
Yeah, I mean, everything starts with a conversation, right? A conversation about what sort of experiences, what sort of opportunities do you want for your kids and your community and your teachers, right? And then from that, then you can say, okay, now in order to achieve that, what are then the physical sort of implications, the design implications of that? And then what are the opportunities in a project? Because as oftentimes, whether it's, in this community or in that community, it's more, are we renovating? Are we building new? What are the sort of constraints that we have on us, right? And the fewer constraints you have physically, obviously, the more you're going to be able to do, right? So I would say it starts in a very creating a space and being intentional in who you invite to that space to have a conversation on both sides, or kind of on all sides, right? Like what do we want here, and how is it going to impact everyone, and most especially those that are sort of experiencing the greatest level of educational and sometimes societal inequity.
You touched on something, renovating and working within a limited space. I mean, the idea of building a new school with this balance is one thing, but we have decades of buildings that don't necessarily have that balance.
Yeah.
So is this something that a renovation can do in the existing supply of older school buildings?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's harder because you have more constraints. Sometimes it's easier because a lot of the bones are there, or not easier, but maybe less expensive. But it's the same level of conversation, right? What do you want to accomplish first? And then how can we create design solutions around that, right? And so oftentimes, I mean, a lot of our schools don't have, like I said, the office right by the front door. Sometimes you walk in and it's this, you're walking right into the central hallway of the school, and the office is kind of either across the way or down the hall and around a corner. So I would say that in almost every project that we do, that's the first thing that we do is say, how can we move admin closer to the front door to, number one, get surveillance, but number two, ensure that when you walk in, you're greeted, right? Both from a security standpoint and that sort of sense of belonging and welcoming standpoint, that human connection standpoint. And then it is about how do you create layers of security and ensure that those opportunities that you have for connection, for building that sense of kind of a community of care in a building, providing space for, what we've seen, especially post-COVID, is just an incredible, I won't even say resurgence, because I don't know that we ever saw it at these levels, but the need to create space for mental health counselors and social emotional supports for kids and for staff. COVID taught us that the school did many things in our society, but one of the things that we most missed when kids were out of school because of COVID was school is kind of a caretaker, right, of our kids. Everything from food insecurity to, identifying child abuse and providing a safe place for kids to be came to light. And so those are now things that we're having to take into consideration, right? It used to be that when we were talking about spaces for kids to kind of self-regulate, you were talking about it mostly around kids with special needs, and we've grown to say it's all of us have the need to work on kind of our wellness, our mental well-being, our need to self-regulate, and doing everything we can to destigmatize access to those resources by their placement, by their design, is also a big piece, right? Because a lot of what we've seen in these big incidences are there were hints all along the way that were missed. And so how do you create an environment in which, whether it's a peer, a teacher, a counselor, has more of an opportunity to catch those hints, and to build the relationships such that the reporting structure can be easier, right? Because you're gonna feel more comfortable if you hear something about a friend or a schoolmate, and maybe you wouldn't feel comfortable taking that to a counselor that you've never spoken to before, you've never seen. But if you have a connection and if you feel a sense of responsibility to your community, you're going to say something more likely, right?
It's wild to think that a building can foster that, but it really can. The environment you're in absolutely can do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. Oftentimes we find our projects that it's the first time when we're designing a new building or designing a renovation that the people in that building, the people in that community have stopped to really think about, what do we want for our kids? What do we want for our city, our community? And it's a building project that's the catalyst for that, right? And then it can also be the vehicle that we use to create those environments that allow for that, not just the conversations, but then the outcomes, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge believer in design as a catalyst for positive social change.
Awesome. Well, that does it for all my questions. Was there anything that you wanted to add that I didn't ask about?
One thing that we work with, again, there after these events, there is a very natural response that happens to wanting to ensure that you do everything you can to ensure that we don't, everything that we can that's within our control to ensure that this doesn't happen again. But I would just encourage communities to ensure that fear doesn't become the primary driver of design, right? That we have to be in a place where we are providing what we need to ensure that kids are safe, secure, teachers are safe and secure, and that our community is, but we also have to do it in the context of these are still places where we want kids to like I said, to have a sense of belonging, to feel like they can thrive and be there to achieve their greatest outcomes, right? And so I would encourage people, and I know over the last 30 years that it's possible to have both. And so don't settle for one or the other, but really push for both.
That's the perfect way to wrap this up.
Awesome.
Don't settle.